Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev, and in today's video, this is going to be an extension of my Intro to Express 2022 video series. And this is what we're going to do is we're going to build a small app without a database, a sodas app. The idea here, the goal of this series here is going to be just kind of set up in the basic Express app using templating. Okay, so again, there's different ways you can use a backend application. You could use it to serve a JSON API, where basically when you send a request, it responds to you with JSON data. Or you can set it up so that way it responds to you with sort of like HTML, okay? And you could just send static HTML files, but generally what makes it backend exciting is when we use templating, so that way we can dynamically generate HTML to send to the client, to the browser. So in this first video, we're going to do is we're going to just focus on setting up our Express app. But I do have this repository, so if you ever look up my GitHub account, AlexMercedCoder, model Express app. Okay, here what you can do is you can find different examples of Express apps at different states. So basically, what we will be building across this video series will be very similar to this, the Express EJS NoDB. But here you can find different versions of like creating an API with Express, with Mongo, with Postgres. Basically, you can see different ways you can see that how the code would look like as a model to help you can understand how you would want to build your own Express app. Okay, so highly recommend exploring this repository. But let's open up VS Code, and I've opened up VS Code to an empty folder. So we're going to be creating what I'm going to call the sodas app. So it's just going to be basically an app. We're going to pretend we're like a soda pop factory, and basically we create different sodas, and we are, seeing, hey, are they, what the color of that soda is, and whether the soda is ready to sell. Okay, and cool. So let's set that up. So here I start off with an empty folder. I'm going to open up my terminal in that folder. Okay, so always, open up that folder in VS Code, so that way your VS Code is opened to that folder. So I can see that my terminal is opened to that folder. Okay, and again, if you don't have quite the same output in your terminal, you can always do pwd, print working directory, to see what folder you're in. So I can see, hey, look, I'm in my Express sodas folder. Okay, so I'll hit clear to clear my terminal. Okay, so what I want to do first is create and this is assuming that you have VS Code installed. This is assuming you have Node installed. To double check whether you have Node installed, just do like node-v, and you should see that I'm right now using version 19. I do have something called Node Version Manager installed that lets me switch versions of Node. I'm going to switch over to 16 for now. No nvm use 16. Okay, so yeah. So now I'm using version 16. Okay, that's something, if you just installed Node from the Node website, you probably just have whatever version of Node you have. NVM is something you would install separately. Just Google how to install Node Version Manager for your operating system. Cool. Okay, so I am all set up as far as like now I want to create a Node project. The way you do that is you type in npm init-y. The dash, basically what happens when you do npm init, it's going to ask you a bunch of questions to set everything up. And honestly, we don't really need to answer those questions. So the -y just basically assumes all the defaults. So that way we just don't have to deal with any of that. It just creates what we need, which is a package.json file. For those who haven't used Node so much, the package.json file is sort of the heart of a Node project. So Node, when it's kind of understanding what's going on in this folder, it's going to use this package.json to really kind of understand like, hey, what libraries did you install? What scripts do you have set up? Things like that. So here I have the package.json. Okay, generally what I like to do is I like to set up a couple scripts. Okay, I'm going to set up, so scripts comes in this section in the package.json, the script section. Okay, generally you always want a start script, so I'm just going to delete the test script and do start. And start's always going to be like node, and then we're eventually going to have a file called server.js, so that's going to be that. But when we are developing, the problem with like Node, which is doing node server.js, is that anytime I make a change to the server.js file, I'm going to have to shut down my server and reopen it so that way the changes take hold. So there's a thing called Nodemon, which you can install. This is one of the few things you would install globally in Node, meaning install it not for your project, but globally. And the way you would do that is you would type in node, or actually npm install. You do -g, meaning it's a global install, and then you would do Nodemon. Okay, sounds kind of like Pokemon. And what Notamon does is that it watches your files. So if any of your files, any of your JavaScript files change, it shuts down the program and restarts it. So that way those changes automatically take hold. Okay, so I can just say here and just create a dev script, and you can create as many scripts as you want. Okay, you can add as many as you want here. It's just whatever name you want the script to have, and then what command that script triggers. So in this case, what I want to trigger is that anytime I run the dev script, it's going to run notamon server.js. Cool. So now I can type in npm start to run the start script, and for anything other than the start script, it would be npm run, then the name of the script. So in this case, dev. So when I type in npm run dev, it's going to look for a package.json. And hey, it's like, oh, look, there's a package.json there. It looks inside to see the script section, sees that there's a dev script, and then we'll run this command. So that's essentially what this is really useful, especially like when you start having really complex projects where you have like these really long commands you need to run on a regular basis. Having a script where you can just type in npm run x to take a small command and turn it into an easy little thing you can run is super, super useful. Okay, so I'm going to set that up. Okay, and then what I want to do is I want to install a few libraries. We're going to install Express. Express is going to be the framework we're going to use to basically create the actual server application. So basically, Express is the library that allows us to say, hey, if a request comes in asking for this URL, send them this JSON back, or send them this HTML file. Send them something back. Okay, then we're going to want .env because we're going to generally want to hide sensitive details. Okay, so .env is a place where we can hide sensitive details, or generally in what's called an environmental variable. Okay, which are generally variables actually that are defined in your operating system, not in your code. The .env library allows us to create a file called a .env file that will be read, and then it'll take all those variables and put them in the environment. So that way we can not have to define certain things in our code that we don't want committing to GitHub. Okay, we're also going to want EJS. EJS is going to be the templating library. It's going to allow us to write HTML files that have JavaScript in them, in the sense that we can actually describe how we want the HTML to be generated with JavaScript, allowing us to like write a lot more HTML with a lot less code, because we can say loop and actually generate HTML in a loop, or generate HTML conditionally, say, hey, if this is true, then put this HTML in the file. A lot of really kind of cool like stuff makes your pages much more dynamic. Okay, so we're gonna have EJS. Anything else we're gonna need? We're eventually going to need method override. We'll talk more about that when we need that. So method override. Anything else I think we need? I think that is good. So again, express, .env, EJS, and method override. I hit enter. It's going to install all those libraries. And you'll see here in the package.json, when it's done installing, there's this section of the package.json called dependencies. Anything you install, if you installed it successfully, should show up in there. Okay, not only should you see this section in your package.json, you should see a node modules folder that essentially has everything installed. And you'll say, hey, I installed only 4 things. Why is there all these folders here? Because not only does it install those 4 libraries, but installs any libraries those libraries use. Okay, so yeah, it ends up installing a bunch of stuff. Okay, and you also notice that it creates this package lock.json file. Don't worry about that. You never really need to touch that file. But essentially what it does, it tracks the dependencies of your dependencies. So my project depends on these 4 libraries. But some of them may depend on the same libraries, like they might depend on something else. So that way it doesn't reinstall the same like library 3 or 4 times. What it does, it tracks the dependencies of your dependencies in this file. But again, not something you really have to worry about. You just need to know that you just need to know that file exists. You don't need to touch it. It's there. Okay. So we installed what we needed. So again, I created a new npm project. That's how I got my package.json. I installed my packages running this command here. Okay, and that created my node modules folder. That created my package lock.json. So now I can begin creating like my basic Express server. Okay, oops, getting in the wrong place. Let me just go back up here. So I'm going to click over here. So I just click over here so that way I can make sure I'm making it in the top folder. I click new file and I'm going to create a server.js. It doesn't matter what the file name is, but we generally call it server.js because we're creating a server. The idea is that we're creating this program that's going to receive requests from things that send requests. That could be like your browser, could be tools like Postman, Insomnia, Thunder Client. These are all HTTP clients that send requests. Okay, that's all a internet browser is. It's essentially just a big HTTP client. It sends requests to servers out in the world and then processes the response from those servers. So when I type in google.com in the browser, all the browser is doing is sending a request to the servers that manage Google's website and then processing that HTML that comes back and showing it to you on the screen. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're now writing the server side of things. We're going to be writing the program that responds to the browser's requests. Okay. So first thing we want to do is import our dependencies. Okay. So I always like to kind of make this fancy. So I'm going to do this. So your dependencies are the things that this file needs that exist outside of this file. Okay. This file dependencies. Okay, so always generally at the top you want to just like import your dependencies. Okay, so right now the main dependencies I have are going to be const express. So I define a variable to hold my dependencies. So express, which is going to, and I'm going to use this require function. And what this require function does is that it's going to bring things from outside of the file. That's how I bring in dependencies. I'm saying, hey, I need something from here, save it in this variable. So I'm going to say, hey, I need Express. Express is one of those libraries that I installed. So whenever I put in just the name of a library, so notice I just wrote Express, then what it's going to do, it's going to use one of the libraries that I have installed. If I did like ./express, then it would look for a file called express.js in the same folder. Okay, so when you put this, that turns it into a file path. So then it looks for a file in that path. When I don't put like a file, like the slashes and stuff, this means it's looking for a library. So it's going to look for one of the libraries that I've installed, which you can see which ones you've installed here in the package.json. Okay, so that's that. So again, I'm going to bring in the Express library. So Express is, again, this is our backend framework. Okay, and then I'm going to bring in, well, we'll bring in method override later. We're going to want to put in .env. Now the way .env works is that you don't need to actually save it in a variable because you just need to call one function in it really quick once, and then you're done with it. So what we do is we just take require .env, and then that's going to return the object from the .env library. I'm not going to need it more than once. So I just chain off of it and say .require, .config. And what this function, this .config function does is that it's going to look in my folder for a file called .env and then read the variables from it. Okay, so let's actually set that up. Let's set up our .env. Okay, so this is what this is going to do is read the .env file. Okay, so I'm going to create a .env file. Okay, and then here we can define any kind of variable you want. So I can call it whatever I want. Generally, a variable you generally always want to kind of have around is a variable called port, and typically, conventionally, you always do like full uppercase, like all uppercase letters for your environmental variables. It just makes it easy to tell like that it's an environmental variable. So port generally represents like what port your server is listening on, because whenever you create a server, you're saying, I want this server to be listening for requests on my computer, but your computer has kind of like a neighborhood has different addresses for different houses. Every computer has different ports that can receive messages, up to like 65,000 different ports. So you have to tell it, hey, which port are you listening on? And you can have kind of one thing listening on each port for messages. So generally, like when you're just developing things, we usually just do like port 3000 or port 4000. Again, there's 65,000 possible numbers. I'm not going to get too detailed about like 3000 is usually a safe one to choose for development. Let's just leave it at that. Okay, so port 3000. Right now we don't need to define any other variables here, but if we wanted to, we could. Okay, and essentially now that variable gets when this file runs, it's going to read that file, and it's going to add all those variables to an object called process.env. Okay, so technically, like, port would be process.env.port. Okay. Don't worry about where this process object is coming from. Just know that, hey, because we did this, this is going to exist, and in that object, this process.env object will be any variables I defined in my .env file. There's a little bit more to it, but let's keep it simple. Okay, so we got our Express library, so wonderful. Then what we're going to want to do is we want to create our application object. So the application object is essentially your server. And essentially you need to tell your server, like, what are you going to do? When a request comes in, what happens? Okay, so first we actually have to create that server. We have to create that object. So usually we create a variable called app, and we say app equals express. Okay, and this function, this express function, is going to return a new application object. That's just the way Express was created. So again, this is going to create our application object. Okay. And then what you want is at the very bottom of your file, you want your server to listen. So we're going to create what's called a server listener. Okay, and usually what we're going to do is you're going to say app.listen. It's a function that tells, hey, this server should start listening for messages. Okay, and it starts the listening process. So we generally want to tell what port to listen on. So we'll do process.env.port. Okay, probably even better. Okay, let me actually create a section for like global variables. So I'll just create a section for global variables. Like a better approach would be to do this. So these are just some variables that we can an area that define variables we want to use. What we do is we create a port variable that equals process.env.port. The reason being is that there's a chance that maybe you are working in an environment where the .env file doesn't exist. So just in case, we do an OR, and then we'll write 3000. So what this does is say, okay, if this exists, we'll use the port environment variable. But if that's undefined, then we will use this number over here. Okay, so either way, it'll be 3000, even if I didn't have this .env file here. Okay, the reason being is that this is not going to get pushed up to GitHub. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a file called .gitignore, because again, generally .env is where you want to hide all your sensitive information, the information you do not want on GitHub, like database credentials, things like that. So generally, you do not want this file pushed to GitHub. So you add this file to your gitignore .env, so that way it gets ignored by Git. So it won't get committed, it won't be part of your repository. The other thing you generally want to ignore is the node modules folder. So I'm going to ignore that too, because you don't need it. Okay, you can always just easily reinstall all your dependencies by doing npm install. So why upload thousands of files to GitHub? It's just a waste of space, and clogs up your repository. Okay, so you don't want to push that up. So generally these two things go in our gitignore file, so that way Git ignores them. Okay, cool. Okay, so let me go back to my server.js. So now that we created this port variable, let me go back to the listen, and instead of using process.env.port, I'm going to use the port variable, and then generally the second argument for this listen function is a callback. The purpose of this callback is just to create like a message, so that way you know your server is listening. So usually it's just like a console.log, and then I'm going to use some backticks and say server listening on, and then use interpolation on port. And this way, watch what happens when I run the program. Okay, so I can now use my script npm run dev, because again, npm run dev is going to take that script that I have in package.json and run the command that I have listed under it, which is nodem on server.js. So if I do npm run dev, It's going to run it and see, like, I get this message. That's the message from that callback here. So basically what happens is that once the server starts, it's going to run this function. And you want this because this allows me to know that, hey, like, the server started listening. And just to double check it, is listening on port 3000. So and again, I'm running this on my computer. So the address for the computer that you're currently on is always either localhost. And the word localhost is really just a disguise. Really what it is that your computer is IP address 127.0.0.1. Okay, but no one really remembers that, or at least it takes a while before that sticks. So what they did is to make it easier, instead of you typing in 127.0.0.1, you can just type in localhost. So localhost is just really another way of saying 127.0.0.1, meaning the computer you are currently on. So on the computer, and again, each computer has all these ports that can have a program listening. We've just told our program to listen on port 3000. So to tell it to listen on port 3000, we do a colon after the server address. Okay, and that's essentially what all website addresses are. All, like, google.com is just a mask over an IP address somewhere. Okay, in the same way 127.0.0.1 is the IP address of you here. Every computer out in the world has an IP address, that, like, a number that we can point to that can send a message to that specific computer. But no one remembers numbers, so we have domain names that get linked to these IP addresses, make it much easier to send, hey, let me go get google.com. Okay? And notice you never had to put like 3000 after google.com. The reason being is that by default, websites are always served on port 80 or 443. So since the browser was designed knowing that, you never have to type that in. It's just like when you type in google.com, it's going to assume, hey, I'm sending this message to port 443. And you just never had to worry about it. Okay? But since we are developing this and we told in our code that this server should be listening on port 3000, we got to specify that. So if I type it, I get this message. This tells me everything's working. Okay? But this tells me cannot get. What Express does when Express is running is that if you make a request and it doesn't know what to do, you get this message. It says, basically what it's saying is, like, I don't know how to respond to this. Because every response is based on two things. It's based on the method. So every request in HTTP world is going to be like a get, a post, a put. And they generally have different connotations. So like get means like get a page, or get something, like you're receiving something, you're not giving anything. Post, put, delete are generally meaning you're requesting some sort of change. So post is usually like to create new information. Put is the update information. Delete is to delete something. And then this is the path. So generally, see, there's nothing here at the end. Okay, so that's your home path, which is just a slash. But if I put like /cheese, see, the path is /cheese. So to say I don't know how to handle a get request to /cheese. Okay, cool. So our server is working. That's good. Okay, so the next step is we would like to start building out a couple more things. Let's create like let's set up some basic middleware. So let's install a few more things. So npm install Morgan. So we want to install Morgan, which is going to be used for logging. So I'm going to install that real quick. And I'm going to just load that in there. Const Morgan equals require Morgan. Again, this is going to be our logger. And the reason why logging is important is because oftentimes, like, again, a server is not a graphical program. There's not like a window I can open that shows me like you would used to with most software. So when you have software running sort of invisibly, the only way to have any kind of visibility into what the program is doing is to have the program log things periodically. So what Morgan's going to do is that every time a request comes into our server, it's going to log details about that request. This is going to allow us to kind of see what's happening on the server. So that's referred to as a piece of middleware. Okay, so I can register that middleware by we'll create a section for middleware. Again, it's just nice to organize your code, makes it easy to kind of know where you're going to put stuff later on as you build out your app. Okay, and then, actually I probably shouldn't have put that there. Let's move that. because we need our app object to exist before we can register middleware. So let's put that here, okay, after we created app. And there's a function called app.use. This is to register middleware with the application. So basically I'm saying, hey, when a request comes into my app, then anything below that, like any app.uses, app.gets, determine what happens to that request. So the first thing I want to happen is I want it to be passed to Morgan, and Morgan has all these little settings. I'm going to just use tiny. You can read Morgan's documentation to find out other settings, but this just means it's going to log a tiny bit of information. Okay, cool. So, and then we're going to want to create like one basic route, just so we have somewhere to register our routes. Okay, so routes are the things that say how to respond. Okay, so we generally just do app.get. We want to do one for like the main page just to test out that it's working. So slash again is that home route. It's when you don't have anything after at the end of the URL. You always have a function, so rec res. And again, we're going to use this response object to respond to requests. So we're going to just do res.send and say, okay, server is working. Okay, and that's good enough for me. Okay, so now watch what happens now. I'm going to run my server again, npm run dev. Okay, and whenever I'm running, if I want to like turn off the server, I just do Control-C. See, that shuts it off. Anytime you have a process running in your terminal, and your terminal's kind of being used up because it's doing something, you can stop it from doing that thing by doing Control-C. Okay, so npm run dev 3000. Okay, so now if I go to just slash, again, just nothing at the end, see, I get server still working. Okay, because basically, again, anytime you type a URL into the browser, that's automatically a GET request. There's no other way. There's nothing you can do other than a GET request through the browser. That's just the way the browser is created. Okay, if you want to do anything else, you need to use other HTTP clients like Insomnia, Postman, Thunder Client that allow you to kind of create your own custom requests, which is more of a conversation when we create an API. Okay, so what I'm going to do, server is working. Now, again, if I go to /cheese, again, see, I never created any kind of route that handles /cheese, so it says cannot get. It means I cannot, you've given me no instructions for how to handle this request. Okay, so that's always a good signal when you're troubleshooting. If you see this message, be like, hey, did I actually create a route for this? Like, did I create a route that handles a GET request to this URL? Let me go look at my code. Okay, so this is always a very, very powerful indicator of things you may need to fix. On top of that, again, see here I'm seeing the logs for Morgan. So now that I have Morgan set up, I can see these logs in my terminal, and I can see, hey, look, a request for slash came in, and that was successful. There was a response, so I got a 200. That means everything's a-okay. But here, you see cheese got 404. 404 means like this page doesn't exist. Okay, so I can see the different requests that are coming into my server to help kind of see what's going on. Okay, and that's going to be very helpful. Okay, so basically what's going to be happening as we go forward, we're going to be creating again a soda app. We're going to be practicing what's called MVC, and I'll talk more about that in the next video. But this was a setup video. I'll see you guys in the next one. Have a great one and enjoy.